Major features. Major features. You see this? Number one, Torah Shebechtav and Torah Sheba'al Peh. This is the written Torah and the oral Torah. You didn't get one? Here. There's one. Okay. Okay, that means that our Jewish tradition teaches us that we have some material written down in the holy books, and some of it was taught orally. We mentioned earlier that the oral Torah and the written Torah, when do they start? All the way back to Sinai, all the way back to even before Sinai, really. Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov speak to God. God speaks to them. It's not necessarily a book. It's not like, what was this guy in America who found a book? I think Scientology, isn't it? Don't they say that this guy Hubbard found a book?
L. Ron Hubbard?
Hubbard, yeah.
It's a science fiction writer.
No, but
On his backside.
obviously, but the concept is fascinating. That he found a book written somewhere. It's amazing that he could read it in the language it was in. This is not what we believe in. We believe that God spoke to man. That's shocking in itself. That's a big enough of a faith statement. But the Torah starts with oral teachings. Even that, you think that when God speaks to you, you use your ears? Does God speak with His mouth? Is it voice? Maybe God speaks to us inside our soul somehow. It reverberates. But prophecy, the idea that God gives us messages, some of it was not merely a book. A book gets written down afterwards. But when God communicates to man, and He told Moshe to write down the Torah, no question about it. So we have a written Torah and an oral Torah. Yes?
How to know when God speaks to you? If your heart judges you, so does the God. That's how.
Yeah, I wish it was so simple. I don't know exactly how to know. Apparently, it's like love. When you're in it, you know. If God speaks to you and it's really God, then you're going to know.
Yes.
That's one way
I gave
to say it.
to some people.
Yeah.
They asked me why did you give it to us?
What did you give?
The tzedakah.
Tzedakah, yes.
Some people, they have not been like poor or anything. I just felt that I want to give them tzedakah, and they asked why, and I said, God said to me to do this. And then they said, how do you know that God told you this? And I know the same way you know what to do once you get up in the morning. That's how.
You're right there.
It's true that God speaks to us in many ways.
You're right, yeah.
In particular, we have a belief that there was an era in which there was prophecy, which is on a whole nother level than what you're describing. God speaks to me, and it motivates me, inspires me. Prophecy was of a whole different kind. It's like, the prophecy that Avram had, go sacrifice your child. He wouldn't do that. He wouldn't do that unless it was absolutely clear prophecy. And our tradition tells us that existed during the First Temple era, and before that, during the time of the forefathers. And there are many prophets mentioned in the Bible, but then the era of prophecy ended in the Second Temple era. And so, but the oral Torah is not exactly equivalent to prophecy. The oral Torah are teachings which were passed down to the Jewish people based on the Torah, explanations of the Torah. And you could say a little bit that the sages in the Second Temple who laid the foundations of the oral Torah, which we study today, what we called earlier Rabbinic Judaism, right? That it's not prophecy, but it is considered to be an extension of the Torah. The tradition gets extended in two ways. That's number 2 on your page. There's a transmitted tradition. Yeah.
The literal is listed twice with the Pardes.
Yeah.
So it's like in the Peshat, but like next to Sod, it's like translated as literal.
Oh, Sod, that's a mistake. Oh, wow. I have to fix that. Sod is not the literal meaning. Sod is the secret. Sod means secrets. That's the Kabbalistic meaning. So that's a mistake. I have to fix it. Thank you. Thank you.
Darash is derived?
Derivation is correct. Yeah. Drasha is what, yeah, that's right.
It's like the way or something, or towards?
It means derivation.
Oh, derivation.
Yeah. Yeah. In the next line, it explains it there. Right. So it's an amazing feature. We're going to focus only a little bit on the number 2 now. What this oral Torah that the rabbis did. That we're celebrating, the spiritual foundations of the oral Torah were laid during the period of of Hanukkah, of the sages. There were 2 parts to that tradition. There was transmissions, like a baton, relay race. Moshe interpreted the Torah, told it to Yeshua to the elders to the prophets. The prophets told it to the men of the Great Assembly. Now we're already in the Second Temple era. And they are the beginning of the sages, the men of the Great Assembly. So there are some traditions which were just orally transmitted. They never got written down until they did, at the end of the Second Temple era. But so part of the tradition is transmitted. But there was also, part of this oral law is chidush. See that word, number 2? Chidush. What does chidush mean? Innovation. Inspired innovation. In our context, we're referring to chidush in Torah. The sages innovated. And like Yaakov said, they didn't just make stuff up. They were inspired, we believe, inspired by God. It's not the same as prophecy, but it's similar in some ways that their words and their innovative interpretations, they had the permission to interpret the Torah in these 4 ways, as you can see. They interpreted the Torah via 13 principles of how to interpret the Torah, which were part of the tradition. There's a tradition about how to interpret the tradition and how to innovate based on the tradition. And this is what we say the foundation of rabbinic Judaism. Of all these laws and oral teachings, some of them were transmitted and some of them were innovated, were created by the sages based on the tradition of the way to read the Torah through these 13 principles. I called it inspired innovation because I like alliteration. TT and II. Transmitted tradition and inspired innovation. TTII. You see that? I'd like to keep it poetic. TT and II. This is the core of our tradition. A lot of the core of the oral law. The oral law includes Mesorah and Chidush. And that's what we're celebrating on Hanukkah. The oral Torah, which blossomed, exploded during and after the Hasmonean era of Hanukkah. So that rebellion engendered this new development of the Jewish people, where the oral Torah blossomed through the work of the sages interpreting and innovating and transmitting the tradition. Is that good? So far so good? Is that clear? Okay, so now put the page aside for a moment. Many features, other features that we're going to look at later. I just want to briefly show you, just for today. We'll continue working on this tomorrow, but look at the chart now. Look at the chart. You have it already from before. And thank you so much, Shmuel, for pointing out the typo that I had there. you'll help future students. I won't. I'll have to correct the page. Sod means secrets. That's the mystical tradition of Judaism. But anyways, looking at this page, the historical framework, I've divided up 3,500 years. I've divided up 3,500 years of Jewish history, roughly, into 7 periods. Who can find for me where is Hanukkah in your period chart? What period is it in?
-500 to 0.
Right, we call it period 3. Right, you see the numbered 1 through 7 on the top row, and then you're right in the third row, Jewish events. So we have Purim, a little bit at the beginning of the Second Temple era, and Hanukkah, and the Hasmoneans leading the revolt towards the end of the Second Temple period. Right? We said what year was it in? Minus 165, right? And it went on for a number of years after that, but that's the number. That's probably when the revolt started. And the Hasmonean ruled until the Great Revolt. What period is that in? Period 4.
129.
Nope. Look at period 4. Period. What's that called? Chazal. Right? Chazal means it's in the 4th row. That term is translated for you in the 4th row, in period 4.
Okay,
Before that is sages. Chachamim of blessed memory. Chazal. It's an acronym. Chachamim zichronam livracha. Ch-z-u. Chachamim zichronam livracha. Sages of blessed memory. That's also a little bit unclear. I have to fix this. Chazal. I should put this. Chachamim zichronam livracha. That's Chazal. So the sages, the period of the sages, and at the beginning of there you see the Jewish events is the Great Revolt. The Great Revolt ended up in year 70 with the horrible destruction of the Second Temple. It's there on your page, the year 70, right? A few years later there was another revolt, but we'll talk about that another time. Right now we're focusing in on our period. And who were the leaders during the Second Temple? No, look at the Second Temple. I'm going back to period 3. We're going back to discuss Hanukkah, just a little bit more. Ezra was one of the leaders. He was one of the leaders of the men of the Great Assembly. The Kohanim, you see Kohanim there, right? We talked about the Kohanim Gedolim. And there's also another group called the scribes. Ezra was known as Ezra HaSofer, the scribe. Because part of what they did during that period was to canonize the Holy Scriptures. That's the written Torah. So the Second Temple era really gave us the foundations of the written Torah, as well as, later on, the foundations of the oral Torah, the works of the sages, Chachamim. Primarily, they lived from 0 to 500, which is period 4. But the foundations, that's why I say the spiritual foundations were laid by the predecessors to the Tanaim and the Amoraim, which were called the pairs. And we'll see that at some point in the first chapter of Pirkei Avot. It describes the chain of tradition leading us through, all the way back from Moshe. You can see that there's some leaders who are grade. They're bolded. You see that the grade section. What's that called? The bolded words in the Jewish leadership row. It says Moshe, Yoshua, and then the elders equals the Zakenim. Highlighted. That's right. These highlighted words, they all appear in the first Mishnah in Pirkei Avot. Moshe kipel Torah Messina, Masar Yeshua, gave it over to Yeshua to the elders to the prophets. Nevi'im, Zakenim Nevi'im, Nevi'im, L'anshei Knesset Gdolah. We're going through 1 to 2 to 3 And then Shimon HaTzadik was one of the last members of the Great Assembly. And famously, I think I mentioned it to you yesterday, I don't know if you remember, or the day before, Shimon HaTzadik, according to our tradition, he went out to greet Alexander the Great when he conquered the land of Israel in year minus 333. So here we're getting close to Chanukah, right? The Greek rule. Obviously, we talked about it. First, we were under Ptolemaic Greeks from Egypt for about 150 years or so. And then only later on did the things get bad, from bad to worse, with the Seleucid Greeks. But the Greek era is what happens, as you can see, the dominant power. If you look at period 3 from the top, it says it's known as the period of the Second Temple. Period 3, period of the Second Temple. The years are from minus 500 to 0. And the dominant powers are Persia and then Greece. It's everything we spoke about in the book. It's here on this chart. We're focusing in on the Second Temple era, which concludes, we have the miracle of the Hanukkah towards the end of it. After Shimon HaTzadik, the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot lists 6 pairs of scholars. 2. That's the way the Jewish leadership worked. And one of them was the head of the Sanhedrin, and one was the president of the Jewish people. One was known as the Av Beit Din, the head of the Beit Din, the Sanhedrin being the high court, and one of them was the president, the political leader. These 2 great rabbis, generation after generation after generation. The final pair mentioned in our tradition was Hillel and Shammai, the most famous ones. And then already the students of Hillel and Shammai are called Tanaim. Tanaim. The authors mentioned in the Mishnah, they're usually what we call Chazal. Tanaim are sort of like the beginning of Chazal. And that's why I say that this Hanukkah story is laying the foundations for the period of the sages, the oral Torah that develops and blossoms. What are the books? Look down at the bottom of Jewish literature. First of all, the first 3 periods give birth to the first major book of Judaism. As you can see, it says a highlighted oral Torah and written Torah, consisting of Halacha and Agadah. We haven't explained those terms yet. They all get written down in the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. But then, that's one book. Then, in the period of Chazal, in period number 4, we have the oral Torah written down and developed, and it gets written down and developed into a massive book, much, much larger than the Tanakh. And it's structured differently. It has a new structure. It's structured by categories, by topics. It's called the Talmud. Of course, there's a few versions of the Talmud. It has a few parts in the Talmud, as you can see, and we're going to discuss this a little bit later. But just showing you the basic structure of why we say that the period of Hanukkah is basically, it's on the border. It's on the border between prophetic Judaism and the period of the sages, rabbinic Judaism. And that's really the foundational time of the oral Torah being written down and developed. You see that? At the bottom of column 4, the oral Torah being written down and developed. This is all the result of Hanukkah. The oral Torah being written down and developed. It all stemmed from the works of the sages, which lived under the Hasmonean rule. Right? The pairs all lived under Hasmonean rule. Right? Since, well, not the first few pairs. The first few pairs were under Greek rule, but the later pairs, the later of the pairs, the last three, I believe, they all lived under the Hasmoneans, and they laid the foundations for the rest of the oral Torah to be written down. Right? What was I quoting to you? The first Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, Masechet Avot. That's part of the Mishnah. So the Mishnah, that's part of the Talmud. That's all these traditions getting written down more than they ever were before, and they're collected in a book called the Mishnah, which turns into a book called the Talmud, and that's what we're celebrating on Hanukkah. Okay, we'll stop here for today. B'ezrat Hashem, bring these pages tomorrow. If you don't, I have extra copies, and we will learn more about the